I just simply will not get.
There's a question.
The media can take its responsibility for not being clear, but the media, in a sense, is also a victim of our own self-centeredness in the United States and a reluctance to look at information outside of our own area. And that's why I think it's so vitally important that a meeting of this time take place. I've been assured by everyone that the people who are here, while they take a strong stand on the coup, are a bunch of are members of a wide variety of political groups. So it is not, strictly speaking, a kind of political event. And even if it were a political event, I would still be inclined to press for a full understanding of all these issues. We need to have information from whatever source to get us out of our own landlocked perspective on the world. So, without further ado, I'm going to go forward. It's my pleasure to introduce Joe Stork, sitting next to me. On my right, he is the Deputy Director of Human Watch's Mideast and North Africa Division, a general expert on human rights issues. Before joining Human Rights Watch in 1996, he co-founded the Mideast Research and Information Project and served as Chief Editor for the Mideast Report, a bi-monthly magazine. He's the author of numerous books and articles on the Middle East, has lectured widely, and he started out as a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkey and holds an MA in International Affairs from Mideast Studies at Columbia University. And having studied some at Columbia University, I'm pleased to introduce him now for perhaps about a 15-minute presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm pleased to be introduced by Columbia University. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Thanks to Mohammed and Osama and everyone who had a hand in organizing this very, very important. And I think, as far as I'm aware, at least on the East Coast of the USA, a kind of unprecedented event. And I do hope that this is just the first of many, because these issues need to be aired. As Richard said, not because we're, at least certainly in my case, I'm not affiliated with any political party or political organization. I'm not here as a supporter of any political group. I'm here because of a really severe human rights crisis in Egypt. As Richard mentioned, I started with Human Rights Watch in 1996, and a lot of the work I've done with the organization since then has involved Egypt. I've made many, many visits to Egypt, worked on reports, many different aspects of the crisis there under Hosni Mubarak. I had the great fortune to have been in Cairo, in Egypt, during the January-February revolution in 2011. I saw that firsthand. It was an extraordinarily exhilarating time of my life, having been working on Egypt for all those years, and even before Human Rights Watch, to see that fantastic explosion of political energy and popular unity was extraordinary, and makes it all the more painful to see what has happened in Egypt, and among other things, the terrible polarization that we've seen in the country. And I have to say, the kinds of issues I've been dealing with, and I'll go into a little more detail in the couple of minutes I have, but the kind of issues that we're looking at, unlawful use of force, and I'm using kind of human rights lingo now, but because, what we do, we're not a conflict resolution organization, we're not even a pro-democracy organization, we're a human rights organization. So that means we look at the Universal Declaration, we look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. We look at the Convention Against Torture, the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women. These are sort of our documents that we use. That's the law. These are the Convention Against Torture, for instance, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I have to remind people that, this was not written by Amnesty International. This was not written by Human Rights Watch. This was written by the international community, to use a phrase, by states, the member states of the United Nations, and it was these states, even if they didn't participate in the writing of these documents, but states like Egypt, for instance, who became states party to these treaties. These are treaties. These treaties represent international legal obligations for the states that sign up to them, and it's on that basis that we make our findings, and that's what we do. We don't rely on what we read in the press, thank God. We also, what we do is we're on the scene. Or my colleagues are on the scene. And sometimes we're criticized for being perhaps a little slow off the mark when something very dramatic happens, an invasion, an occupation, this kind of thing. It sometimes takes us a few days or sometimes even a few months. But we don't go out there with our findings until we think we've got them right, and that usually takes some time. Let me just run quickly through what I see as the major issues here. I mentioned the unlawful use of force because that's what we saw in sort of legal terms, what underlies what many of you have called, and I think quite appropriately, a massacre and Rabba. And of course, Rabba was merely the worst in terms of numbers of fatalities, in terms of grievous harm to persons, was merely the worst in a whole series of which maybe you could call lesser massacres that happened in the days, beginning in the days of the week, in fact, even the first week after June 30th, July 3rd. Let's assume, and again, just really I'm here to put a kind of a human rights analysis on these events. Let's assume that Rabba, the demonstration, the sit-in there, I've been to the scene after the events. I've been there. I've seen the lay of the land. It's, we're talking about enormous numbers of people in a kind of a major highway crossroads in a major part of Medina Nasser, a major part of Cairo. They were there. The people, the protesters were there for many, many weeks. It's largely, there are many government buildings, but it's largely a residential area. There are lots of apartment buildings and so forth. So yes, we know that residents were inconvenienced, to put it mildly. They were pissed, frankly. Many of them. They wanted that demonstration to end. There were many complaints put forward to the government. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that there might have been a case that the government could have made for dispersing, and for that sit-in, which tied up a very considerable part of the city, for it to end. But how do you do that? Especially when you're going into that, now we're talking about early August, middle of August, when you've had these incidents, already 4 or 5 incidents, in which scores of people have been killed, precisely because of the kind of knee-jerk reaction of Egyptian security forces to use lethal force. Now, in human rights law, there are certain standards that have been developed. One of them is the UN Basic Principles on the Use of Force and Firearms by law enforcement officials. And here I'm going to quote very briefly from that document. In the dispersal of assemblies that are unlawful but nonviolent, law enforcement officials shall avoid the use of force, or, where it is not practical, shall restrict such force to the minimum extent necessary. So, international law wouldn't rule out, de facto, absolutely, under no circumstances should live fire be used. But it sets down very strict conditions, very strict in which that live fire might be used, and if it's used, how it's to be used. And obviously we can see in a situation where when the smoke cleared and when the fires were put out, when we saw, by the government's own acknowledgement, well over 600 people. And we have good reason to think the toll was considerably high. The death toll from that one incident, that one day-long clash, was considerably higher than 638, I think was the number the Ministry of Health had put out, until they was told by the Ministry of Defense to stop counting, and certainly to stop publicizing what the death count was. Egypt has suffered from now paroxysms of violence. We've seen the death toll since July 3rd, has been, by some estimates, well over 3,200 people. Okay, now that includes a large number, like about 280, according to the government, security officials. But they weren't killed in Rabat. They weren't killed in those classes. They were killed in attacks. There is a terrorism problem. There's a serious terrorism problem that Egypt is confronting today, partly coming out of this polarization that I spoke of earlier. So, the authorities certainly do have a serious security issues, and Egyptians of every walk of life face serious security issues. But when you have a situation where after an attack on a police station, for instance, there have been a number of these in Cairo itself, never mind in Sinai, places far removed from Cairo. When minutes after the attack, you have the Minister of Interior saying it was the Muslim Brotherhood. Minutes after the attack, obviously no investigation. Obviously no, and even today, now many months after some of these attacks, not a shred of evidence has been produced linking these attacks to the Muslim Brotherhood. And that organization has, number one, that organization has denied those attacks. Number two, another organization, or actually a couple of different organizations, but primarily one, Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, have claimed the attacks. Okay, just in the last 2 days, a Cairo court actually pronounced that Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, which operates mainly out of Sinai, as far as we understand, defined it as a terrorist organization. Now we know the government has labeled Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, again, without producing any kind of substantiation for that accusation. But no court, interestingly, as far as I'm aware, and I'm ready to be corrected, no court, as is required under Egyptian law for that designation to have the force of law, a court has to come out. It hasn't happened, actually, in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood. Not that that stopped the authorities from, the rather vicious and, in many respects, deadly campaign that they've launched. A couple of other issues. Obviously, the issue of torture is a major problem, continues to be a major problem. I should say that all of these violations, human rights violations, that I'm mentioning very quickly in a very cursory fashion this afternoon, there are violations that have occurred. They occurred under Mubarak on a large scale. They occurred under the SCAF, the Supreme Committee of the Armed Forces, that ran the country from February 2011 until Morsi took over as president in June 30th, 2012. And then under Morsi himself, these violations continue. Let me be quite candid about that. But we've seen spike is the word we sometimes use colloquially here to describe a phenomenon where you just see an incredible upsurge in these really serious violations, including, as I mentioned, torture, I mentioned unlawful killings, sometimes amounting to executions. We're talking, if you want to talk about justice, we should talk about justice. We should talk about the problem of the inability of certainly people facing politicized charges or political charges in Egypt today to get a fair hearing. I mentioned the lack of any evidence to support the terrorist label that the government has put on the Brotherhood. But if any of you have been following the trial of the Al Jazeera English correspondents, but worth mentioning, there are these three correspondents, an Australian, an Egyptian Canadian and an Egyptian. But then there's about 20 other people in that case who are all Egyptians. So the problem that's facing a couple of high-profile international journalists is facing many, many more Egyptian journalists, okay? And if you follow that particular trial, you see that hearing after hearing, and at least they had hearings, which, as you know from listening to Sarah, not everybody has even had a judicial hearing or actually faced charges. But the charges in the case of these, of what I'll call for shorthand, the Jazeera case, it's hearing after hearing, there's just no evidence produced. And these guys, and I think I'm correct in saying they're all guys, these guys have been in prison now for many, many, not as long as Khalid, to be sure, Khalid Kazaz, but have been in prison for many months now. Not allowed. The judge refuses to allow them out on bail. Again, completely, a complete miscarriage of, just a shocking lack of compliance with basic fair trial standards. The government itself, the Ministry of Interior people, told the Associated Press back in March that 16 or 17,000 people were in Egypt, which is an enormous number. But we also know that's not the full count. We know on the basis of the good work that Egyptian human rights organizations have done. I mean, they've documented by name, age, where they were arrested, what they're allegedly, the charges they're facing, and so on. Well over 21,000, and those are the cases they've documented. So they know, and I think we can assume that the actual number, we don't know it, frankly. We don't know, but we know it's enormous. And then you have this travesty of a couple of weeks ago, where a court in Minya, in Upper Egypt, issued death sentences against 529 people after a hearing lasting approximately 1 hour. I didn't note down who this quote came. I mean, it's from a judicial official involved in the case. Here's what he said afterwards. He told the media, "We are in exceptional circumstances. We don't have time to summon each and every defendant, prove their presence, confirm who are their lawyers. Now no one would dare to think to attack a police station or a state institution after they saw the death penalties falling on their group's heads." End quote. The crime for which these 529 people were sentenced to death was an incident shortly after the Rabba attacks in which one policeman was killed. Now that's, a crime was committed there. Let's acknowledge a crime was committed there. Perpetrators should be held accountable, no question. But we do know, just common sense tells us that 529 people were not responsible for the death of this one policeman. I think in the interest of allowing things to... just let me mention a couple of other issues. I was very glad to see the poster up here about destruction of churches, because that's been, and again, reflecting the polarization I referred to earlier. There had been real serious problems of sectarian violence. Again, these go back many, many years, but again, we've seen a spike. And I have to say, this is an area where I think Muslim Brotherhood leaders have to take some responsibility themselves in terms of some of the things that were said from platforms at Rabba and elsewhere that helped contribute to this. This is, it certainly became another spike in these kinds of attacks after July 3rd, and then again after August 14th, the Rabba massacre. Just one other thing. The first piece of major legislation under this sort of interim government of under Mansour, of course we know the power behind that particular throne, the former defense minister Sisi. The first major piece of legislation came down in late November, and it basically allows the Ministry of Interior to ban any meeting of a public nature, which involves 10 people or more, allows the forcible dispersal of such assemblies, protest demonstrations. If even a single stone is thrown, in the words, to quote the law again, if any criminal act emanates from participants. So let's say you have a political demonstration, a protest demonstration, and one individual throws a rock against it. Not hard to imagine that happening. Let's acknowledge that. According to the letter of the law, this allows the authorities to wade right in with the batons, with their water cannons, or with their, with their rifles. What we saw, I think it was the 24th of November when the law when it became law by decree. 2 days later, activists, not Islamists, not Muslim Brothers, activists who were people who were mobilizing for the January 25th revolution, held a demonstration to basically test the law, frankly, held a demonstration, I forget, I think it might have been at the Supreme Court, I forget where they held it, but it was to protest military trials of civilians, bringing civilians before military courts. Again, a problem. It was under Mubarak, it was under the SCAF, it was under Morsi, and it was under the current government. And again, the police waded in, and that's where you saw the dragnet really extend well beyond Islamist offenders to include many of the secular/leftist activists who were so instrumental in mobilizing for the February 2011 revolution. That's good. I am just going to take that and stop, perhaps a bit abruptly, but let me turn it over to turn back to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to be as quick as I can. I'm happy to introduce Medea Benjamin, and she has a very distinguished list. She actually asked me to shorten it. And I hate to do this because it's an outstanding record. It's my great pleasure to introduce her. She's the co-founder of the women's peace group Code Pink and the human rights organization Global Exchange. Has written 8 books. The latest is Drone Warfare, the Killing by Remote Control, has campaigned against the use of drones. She was in, the significant part of this that I can't leave out is she was in Egypt during the time of the revolution and has traveled to Egypt many times on her way to Gaza, where she's also doing work. Her latest attempt to go to Gaza was in March, when she had arranged had organized a 100-woman global delegation to meet with Palestinian women for International Women's Day. The Egyptian authorities, however, stopped her at the airport, put her in jail, then violently attacked and deported her. Upon return, she's been very outspoken against the Egyptian military government and U.S. government funds going to Egypt. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Benjamin. Oh, I got it appropriately delivered. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me here, and I feel strange telling my story when we hear these horrendous stories. Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing the story about your husband's horrible imprisonment, and Lamia, who by video told us about the horrendous death of her brother. In my case, as Richard said, my involvement around Egypt really came through my involvement around the Israeli-Palestinian struggle. And I wonder if those of you here, how many of you are either Egyptian American or Egyptians? Could you raise your hands? So the more I learn about what's going on in Egypt, the more I really feel that this is an issue for everybody in this country, because the U.S. has been so involved for decades in propping up the Mubarak dictatorship that really led to the situation today. And if we hadn't been giving over $1 billion every year to the military government in Egypt, the Egyptian people would have figured out by now their own democratic society. And so, yes, we are responsible. I had been going to Egypt because the Israelis would not let us into Gaza, and I had wanted, particularly after 2006, that terrible Israeli invasion, Operation Cast Lead, when over 1,400 people were killed in Gaza, wanted to go in, see for myself, bring humanitarian aid. And we organized 7 trips since 2006, always going through Egypt. And in the process, I became friendly with a number of Egyptians. Some of them were part of the April 6th movement. Some of them were Egyptians who were risking their lives going out on the street under the Mubarak dictatorship to protest. And they joined us in solidarity with the Palestinians. I happened to be going to Gaza just when the Egyptian revolution broke out, and instead of going on to Gaza, I had the opportunity to spend 2 weeks in Tahrir Square. I must say, some of the most exhilarating weeks of my life. I, as a young girl, had been to Woodstock. This was like Woodstock without the sex and the drugs, and the music was different, but it was wild and wonderful. And so many of my Egyptian friends would say to me, I was always so ashamed to be Egyptian. We withstood decades of this dictatorship and we didn't rise up. And suddenly in Tahrir Square, to see the Egyptian people rising up and loving one another, no matter if they were secular or religious or Coptic or whatever, they said, it makes me feel proud for the first time to be Egyptian. And I cried every single day I was out there. It was just absolutely beautiful, the outpouring of humanity. The people of Gaza, meanwhile, were suffering just like the Egyptians suffered after the upheaval. When Morsi came in, he opened the gates to Gaza and made it easier for people to go in and out. When Morsi was overthrown, all of that changed. The tunnels that had been the lifeblood for people inside Gaza were closed down. The border itself, where about 1,500 people a day had crossed, was pretty much closed down. And people could not get in and out of there. So we had this call from inside Gaza from the women saying, please, we are desperate, do something, come here. And that's why we organized this 100-person delegation. I was going early to set it up. People were coming from 8 different countries. We had Nobel Peace Prize winners. We had doctors, lawyers, professional women. When I got there, having worked with the Egyptian government to set this up, I had no idea that I would be stopped, but I was stopped at the border. When I got into the Cairo airport, gave in my passport, I was taken aside, never told why, held for 17 hours, not allowed to see anybody from the U.S. Embassy, not that they really tried to see me, but then I was told that I was being deported. When I said, can I please wait and see somebody from the embassy, I was thrown on the ground, their knees into my back. I was pulled so violently that I heard a pop of my arm coming out of a shoulder. I started screaming, and despite that, they put 2 sets of handcuffs on me. And when I was screaming in pain, you could see the bones sticking out of my arm there. They took off my scarf and stuffed it into my mouth. And that's how they dragged me down the hallways of the airport to put me on a Turkish airline plane. The airline said, we cannot take her like this, sorry, you must call an ambulance. The ambulance came. The Egyptian wonderful doctor said, she is not fit to get on an airplane. She must go to a hospital and have her arm reset. The Egyptian security would not let me go to a hospital and forced me not only to get on a plane, but to sit next to the 2 guys that did that to me on the plane. Luckily, there was the stewardess asked, was there a doctor on the plane? There was not only a doctor, but there was an Egyptian orthopedic surgeon who was my savior and made a little bed on the hall, in the aisle, and reset my arm on the plane. And when I got to Turkey, I was allowed to go to the hospital. But I tell this story because if you see what the Egyptian security was willing to do to me, I'm 61 years old, I'm an American who has devoted her life to peace, and that they had absolutely no compunction with me, it does give you a little bit of an inkling how they treat Egyptians, and we've heard some of this today. It also meant to me that I wake up, I'm in pain every single day. It will take months and months to heal, and I wake up about 3 or 4 in the morning, and every time I wake up, I think, poor Egyptian people, what can we do to be of help? And so that's the silver lining in this story. And Joe talked about being a human rights activist. I want to say that I'm not, excuse me with great respect, a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood. I am a feminist, Jewish, secular person who really believes in the separation of politics and religion. I don't like a Jewish state, and I don't like Islamic states. But I do love liberty, freedom, human rights, respect for law, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and there is none of that in Egypt today. And so it doesn't matter what our beliefs are, as long as we come together as a human family and say, when people are in need, they need our support. And one of the things that really makes me upset is how little the American people know about what's going on. I'd love to see somebody do a poll to say what happened in Rabat Square, and people, I'm sure, over 90% of them, and I hate to say this, would say, what? What is that? If you ask American people, how many people were killed after the overthrow of the Morsi government, they would know. How many people in jail, they would have absolutely no idea. So our number one thing, and why I wanted to come here and be part of this, is how do we educate people in this country? How do we get this information out? And I'm so glad we're live streaming, and this will be available for people to listen to. But we've got to find more ways collectively to get this information out. The other thing we have to understand is that our government's been very confused about this and wants to make nice with the military regime, wants to see the elections happen, and we know Sisi will be elected. That's a foregone conclusion, because they want to get on with the business of giving this, quote, military aid, which really is money given to U.S. military companies, and they're dependent on this. It's part of the military-industrial complex. It's part of the U.S. One-sided policy towards Israel. And so they want to move ahead, and they are looking for excuses to be able to resume the aid that has been cut off to Egypt, resume more normalized relations with the Egyptian government. And we have to stop that, and one of the only ways we can stop that is educating the American people. What we have to educate them is not only what's going on now, but what are the plans, because there are future new counterterrorism legislation that's set to be approved that will further repress free expression, that will expand the definition of terrorism to include damaging national unity, natural resources, monuments, communication systems, financial or banking systems, the national economy, or hindering the work of regional and international judicial bodies and diplomatic missions. Imagine, under that definition, who can be called a terrorist. And these new counterterrorism laws will also expand who can be tried and convicted of capital punishment. And that will include people who are involved in managing or administrating terrorist groups, and now the Muslim Brotherhood is considered a terrorist organization. So we have to make sure that there is no opening up of U.S. Money to the military regime without basic things like releasing the political prisoners, investigating and holding accountable those who are responsible for the brutal attacks and killings of so many people since the Morsi government was overthrown, and the lifting restrictions on public assembly, declassifying Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, and allowing them to work in all aspects of life, including in the electoral process. And so in closing, I want to say that we, in the Egyptian American and non-Egyptian American community, have to find ways that we work together to do this kind of education, to protest all over the world at Egyptian embassies or anywhere that people who are represented this Egyptian government come, like we did last week at the Chamber of Commerce when the finance minister of Egypt came, and my partner Ty Berry jumped on the stage to say no U.S. money to support the Egyptian military coup until he was dragged off of that stage. That video is going viral. Let's do more of that. Let's shame the Egyptian government, and let's make sure that the U.S. government does not normalize relations with this Egyptian coup. Thank you.
And I want to thank both of our speakers who have, I've been keeping track of the time, have been very, very close on what their planned time is. and they've done a wonderful job. And I want to underscore one thing that Ms. Benjamin has said that I think is very important, and you need to attach. As Americans, the isolation of the American community is for someone who's lived abroad, is frightening. We are simply not well informed about the world around us, and we are not in a position, as we might have been 50 years ago, to be the only dominant voice, and we simply have got to be better in affairs. Look, she's just explained that the events in Egypt are connected to these other events in the Middle East, and the entirety of the Middle East relates to that portion of the world that is Islamic. And we're now talking about a huge percentage of humankind. And we cannot ignore these issues. It's not a question of agreeing with Mr. Stork or Ms. Benjamin. It's a question of being informed about what point of view they have to offer. And I thank them both for coming. I'm honored. And now it's my honor to introduce, for perhaps a briefer presentation, Miata Abdel Latif, I hope I pronounced it correctly, an Egyptian French citizen born, raised, and educated in Cairo, graduated from American University in Cairo, majoring in business administration, worked as an accountant for several years, but then left with her husband to live in several other countries where he was assigned by a multinational company for which he worked. She has 4 children who grew up with a multicultural background, and that has stood them in good stead as they try to understand the truth about things in Egypt. She spent 35 days in Rabat after the unlawful killings that took place, and she is here. She stated that she has decided to clarify the truth wherever I go, as it being a peaceful sit-in in protest against the military coup that deprived the Egyptian people of their votes. And with that introduction, I'm happy to turn to Monza. She's at the end. I didn't go quite directly down the paper, but I'm not leaving out Sarah. Sarah, I'll get to you. Okay? Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Well, let me tell you, my speech will be on the occasion of the play we are watching now in Egypt, which is called the Presidential Elections. Actually, I'm so grateful for Medea and for John for their speech. It really reflects what's going on in Egypt. We are living a play, but a very horrifying play, actually. The coup government in Egypt is calling for presidential elections. Whereas there is an elected president already existing, but we don't know where he is. Actually, Dr. Mohammed Morsi is the legitimate elected president. People ask what's the solution for what's going on in Egypt. I say the solution is this man. This man, I would say, is the man of the century, not just the man of the year. Who is this man? He is the legitimate president of the Arab Republic of Egypt. He's the first elected president in the history of Egypt. We say the history of Egypt is around 7,000 years. In other words, he's the Barack Obama of Egypt. He's the Francois Hollande of Egypt. He's the elected president by the people of Egypt. So let's ask ourselves and all other honorable people of America and France, where is Barack Obama, where is Francois Hollande, and where is Dr. Mohammed Morsi? The answer will be as follows. Barack Obama is in the White House. Is in the White House doing his job as the President of the United States of America. Francois Hollande is in the Palais Champs-Élysées, where he's doing his job as the French president, as the president of Republic of France. But here comes the question: where is our president? Where's Mohammed Morsi? Where's Dr. Mohammed Morsi? Well, we don't know. Here's the surprise: we don't know. Actually, now, in this moment, we don't know where is Dr. Mohammed Morsi. Our president was doing his job in the presidential palace, and all at once he disappeared with most of his assistants and counselors. In other words, they were kidnapped. By who? By the general commander of the army, who is also the minister of defense in the government that was working for the kidnapped president. What does that mean? Doesn't make any sense, does it? The Army General Commander, who presented the oath of God to the President that he will abide with the Constitution and law in front of his boss, and this boss was his President, whom he kidnapped, now we don't know where he is in this very moment. And how about the Republican guards who get their orders directly from the President? No, they didn't listen. They didn't listen to the orders of their boss, of the President of Egypt, and violated their job description of protecting the President of Egypt. They also cheated on the people of Egypt who trusted them for protecting the President and who pay their salaries from their tax income, from their tax dues, I mean. What's the excuse, and what's the reason? They claim around 33 million people came down the streets and stayed in Tahrir squares for 6 hours, dancing and singing, calling for the removal of the President of office. They were trying to play the game, they were trying to play the same story of removing the previous President, Hosni Mubarak, who inherited the presidency 30 years ago from his ancestor, Anwar Sadat, and whom people revolted against for 18 days, when 800 people were killed and thousands were injured. While during the so-called 33 million revolution, people were totally protected by the police and military and resulted in no single blood drop. So what do we call that? A revolution or a coup? Since the 3rd of July, which was the date when the General Commander kidnapped our elected President, since then, the People's Security Forces, whether police or army, have been killing, injuring, detaining demonstrators in the streets who demand nothing but the return of the legitimacy and the outcomes of 5 consecutive elections. 9 months have passed and people are peacefully demonstrating in the streets on daily basis after the dispersal of the famous Rabaa and Nahda sit-ins through one of the worst massacres in the history of humanity, where thousands were killed in few hours. The people of Egypt are not giving in to the fact that our elected president is not there anymore. Statistics show scary numbers of fatalities and injuries, even more terrifying numbers of detainees with no charges or fair trials. And we had an example of Sarah's husband. All those crimes are taking place under the excuse of violating the law. What's that? What does that mean? What law are we talking about when the Constitution is suspended against the will of the majority who voted for the Constitution? What law that discriminates against the will of the majority in favor of the minority? What law gives the Army General Commander the right to erase people's democratic choices and use the country's own arms against the people who refuse the rule of the army? The man who ruled Egypt for only 1 year was taken out of office by the force of the military and not the force of ballot boxes. This man was about to work wonders for Egypt with regard to providing the poor people of Egypt their basic needs of food. All achievements on economic levels are proven by numbers, but there is no space for mentioning details now. This man was humble, simple, ethical. He would not accept any single bloodshed during his reign, but rather would accept being verbally humiliated day and night in all media outlets without even shutting a TV channel or detaining a journalist. This man would go pray in a mosque where all people would talk to him freely with no barriers. This man would stop his car driver to listen to an old lady in the street about the problem in her life that she needed help for, and he would respond instantly. This man was a unique ruler of this time. This man never tended to conspire against his political opponents or opposition, or else he would have never been kidnapped by the people who could not and will not survive with fair democracy that may deprive them from monetary unlawful interests. This man is rarely found in history and will never be found easily. This man may sacrifice his life along with his families to assess the meaning of the newly born democracy in Egypt for the generations to come. This man's name will be engraved in history as the president who endangered his life for securing the free choice of the people of his country as well as securing prosperity and justice for all descendants, for all our descendants. Let me give you a little bio of the first elected president of Egypt, as quoted by my son through one of his Facebook posts. Dr. Morsi came out of poverty in public education, in a public educational and social system. Upon finishing his studies, he went to the United States and obtained his PhD from one of the major universities in the United States, University of Southern California. He excelled in academia, gaining an engineering PhD, publishing papers in scientific journals, and eventually winning a place teaching at the prestigious American University, California State University. And then he made history by becoming the first freely and fairly elected president in Egypt's entire history. To me, it seems like what Americans call the American dream, except I prefer to call it the Egyptian dream. Is this a person that could be called a terrorist? A final message that I would like to send to the European Union, where my country belongs to, France belongs to the European Union. If you would like to find a solution to the crisis in Egypt, you should not send your delegate, Baroness Catherine Ashton, to speak to any official representing the people of Egypt, but the legitimate president of the people of Egypt, which is Dr. Mohamed Morsi.
Thank you very much. And another indication of how broad-based the number of speakers have been today, and I am impressed. They said they represented different points of view, all on one side against the coup, of course, but still representing a very diverse group. The last speaker is Dr. Sarah Otifi, a member of the Egyptians Abroad for Democracy, a member of the July 3rd anti-coup movement, but from an American, from the city of Chicago, a financial consultant, and I'm happy to have her perspective on these events. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming here for our event. First of all, I want to say thank you to Joe and to the media for coming here. Thank you so much for helping us and supporting us here. Just over a year ago, Egyptians threw off the shackles of the military dictatorship and took in the middle of the civil democracy, becoming for a short period the worshiper of liberty and equality throughout the Arab world. And in June 24, 2012, Dr. Mohamed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, Freedom and Justice Party won the country the first election. It was the first time the Egyptian president has been formally elected from outside the military establishment. And that's for that day. I was so proud to say I'm Egyptian original. I born in Egypt, I grew up in here, but I'm so proud to be Egyptian for that day. By July 3rd, 2013, President Morsi had been kidnapped and ousted in a military coup. The uprising against the previous Mubarak regime resulted in the free and the fair election for President Morsi, a new dawn of democracy and the human right in Egypt and for the Egyptian too. The current situation has seen the rapid destruction of that new promise and an excuse for the military to regain a control. Everyone in Egypt, and I think everyone in America too, should be concerned about the legality and the consequence of the military overturning. It is first democratically elected government. Whatever is stated justification, disenchantment with democratically elected leaders cannot legitimize, the use of force and should never be used to remove democratically elected governments and elected free presidents. We can see where Egypt has descended to the aftermath of the coup. The new military installed regime does not appear to be interested in surviving Egyptian democracy. The hallmark of democratic state had vanished almost immediately. Morsi and his administration and Morsi's sister Sarah and her husband had been kidnapped and detained in secret location by the military. Suddenly, historic criminal charges have surfaced and been leveled against them. So far, these detainees have not had access to their family for a long period of time or legal teams. How they are being treated, is anyone guess? I think now you know after Sister Sarah she talked about her husband's situation. Many of Morsi's supporters have gathered in various parts of the country in order peacefully protest against the military intervention. As tension escalated, the military responded to the civilian protests in an all-too unpredicted manner. On July 8, 51 people were killed when lethal force was used on the procession gathering outside the officer club, believed to be where Dr. Morsi was detained. This level of violence occurred again in July 27, when 74 people were reported by the Human Rights Watch to have been killed, many shot in the head and the chest. By July 31st, Amnesty International was reported that the Egyptian military cabinet had declared in televised statement that pro-Morsi sit in the Greater Cairo were to be considered threatening to national security. I want to say, excuse me, what kind of terrorism here? People in the street peacefully protest. When you look at the United Nations and we look at all the governments around the world, argued the Egyptian military coup to show restraint, but they did not listen. And everybody know what happened in Rabat Square, in Namada, and Ramses, and everywhere in Egypt. About 5,000 people being killed, and some burned alive. New Holocaust in Egypt. For me, I remember what Holocaust was in Germany. Now it's another Holocaust in Egypt. 5,000 people killed and burned alive. There are worldwide concerns about, the escalation of violence. Within this increased violence and risk in the world, it is time for the international community to take a good, long, hard look at itself. The mechanism of redress need to be strengthened, as there are certainly many difficulties to obtain redress for the victim of atrocities. Traditional human rights mechanisms such as the United Nations, Special Reporter in the Right to Freedom, Peaceful Assembly, and all the associations, democratic nations should recognize the great promise shown in the week of the Arab Spring in Egypt. The fleeting democracy that in Egypt should not be allowed to escalate to another Syria or fall into a cycle of a coup after a coup like Pakistan. The free world should raise to its responsibilities and take a global leadership role in this issue. While the rest of the international community pointed to the best word to use when describing the coup and how they should react to it, there are already preparations being made by others to ensure that those responsible for atrocity against the Egyptian civilian can be brought to justice. Persecuting military leaders using the principle of universal jurisdiction can be difficult, but let be warning to the military leadership in Egypt. Let be warning to the Mr. Sisi. For me, he's a killer, and I want him to bar injustice. It is the time for the free world to lead the way, bringing this to end. This situation in Egypt must be referred to the CICC by the Security Council, finding that human rights lawyer now will be waiting in a court across the world for Egyptian military coup leaders with evidence that they have committed heinous international crime. Thank you for coming and supporting us.
We do have just a few minutes left in this segment, in this panel, and I've been given 3 questions. I think one may have been delivered down the table. These all are worded in a general sense, so I think I got one question that was directed to Joe Stork and Ms. Benjamin, but I have, but this question I believe is directed to Masa. The question, who are you and who was your father? And I think you perhaps should answer that before I go on. Okay?
Yeah, I was asked to say who was my father, because my father was an army general who worked as the general manager of the faculty of military for like 15 years. So General Tantawi was one of his students, and Abdel Hosni Mubarak as well was one of his students. So the first message I sent to Sisi from over the stage in Rabat, I told him, you were not a student of my father's, but I can guarantee that my father was alive at this time. He would have never ever accepted what you're doing, because he told his students to use the arms against the enemies, but not against their own people.
Thank you so very much. Now, these questions that I have here, I have three general questions for all the panel. I'll let any panelist answer who wants to. The first question, I'm asking this because I'm not sure. I have gotten a question that has, I said, what do the four fingers mean? And I'll let anyone on the panel answer that. I think that's a very important, because these symbols are so important for our understanding of these things. So please, I have to just open it up.
That's fine. Fourth, it mean, it's four. The square in Egypt is called Rabah Square. What does it mean, four? That's the name, of the square. And after the massacre, after, the Holocaust happened there, 5,000 people killed. It's called, the fourth, sign for standing and supporting for the right, for justice and the freedom.
And doing this can get you.
Yeah. Well, I have the rest of
And you know what? I will do both hands. We're ready for that.
Thank you. The other two questions are closely related, but I will give them to each member of the panel, asking each one to be brief in their answers. First of all, what is your advice for Americans to support Egypt? And the second question is so close, I'm just going to give them both out. How does the panel suggest that the United States stop or impede the billions of dollars being given to the factions? Well, I think they mean the military in Egypt. It appears the letters and calls via the U.S. Congress and Senate are of no avail so far. But both of those are reasonable and related questions. So let me go down the panel, ask you to be brief. We have 7 official minutes left, and so if you can stay under 2 for each of your 4, you'll each get a chance to speak. Okay, please go down the panel and give me your
Okay, I think in a sense, the second question answers the first question. That is, what can Americans do? I think it's, impact that delivery of aid that's in the pipeline. And I think Medea's actually summed it up very well in her conclusion in terms of, really that's the task before us as Americans, is to ensure that American law is followed. And that second question kind of suggested that it's useless to sort of be dealing with the U.S. Congress people, and that they, in fact, it's frustrating as hell, but useless. You got to do it. It's the way the game is played here. I think having events like this, having discussions. The next one I would suggest, get somebody from the Egyptian consulate up here and make that person kind of defend what's going on. Set off a debate here. I think that would be very useful. I also think go to the media in your towns. Get to meet with the editors. Bring them what we put out. Bring them what Code Pig puts out. Bring them what Egyptian human rights organizations are